Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm Steph.
And I'm Holly, and we are coming to you live from the National Centre for Writing at Dragon Hall in Norwich.
Dragon Hall, which is feeling very, very busy today. It's a very busy Friday for us. We've got lots of things going on in our building, which you can probably hear rumbling away in the background.
But it's great. The building is alive with creativity and people telling their own stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And also we're getting to podcast face to face for a nice change because we're often recording in separate rooms to try and preserve the sound quality. But actually, it's also just really nice to see you in person, Holly.
It is. It's good to be here.
And we recently just finished our City of Literature weekend at Norfolk and Norwich Festival, which kind of begins, that sort of marks the summer season for us, really, doesn't it? And how was that for you?
Oh, yeah, I think we've just about recovered, haven't we? It was an absolutely brilliant weekend, as ever. Just so many fantastic speakers and lovely audience. But yeah, this year we really did battle the elements. We had to deal with pouring rain on 2 out of the 3 days. So lots of teamwork and pulling together. And thank you to all of the authors who waded through the rain to be with us. But you know what? It just added to the atmosphere, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my favourite things was that our Page Against the Machine event, which was due to happen outside in the beautiful plantation gardens, couldn't take place outside because the plantation gardens was basically a big lake. Yes, it turned into a big lake. But everyone came and joined us in Dragon Hall instead. So actually, I thought everyone would just, not turn up, go home because it's raining. But everyone came out and had a read with us, a global reading event.
I know, that is the power, isn't it, of our literary community, is that wanting to be together. And even though Page Against the Machine is essentially a silent reading event, it's about being together and sharing it and sharing that experience. No, it was really special, actually, and something we couldn't have predicted. But no, thank you to everybody who came over to Dragon Hall and we read together.
I think that was it's a nice, powerful, a quiet but powerful statement.
It was. So what are we doing today, Steph?
So in this episode, we're joined by writers and NCW Academy tutors, Dan Richards and Edward Parnell. Edward's been on the podcast with me before, and they are discussing the journey from researching to writing and editing a work of narrative non-fiction.
Dan Richards is a writer and journalist who specialises in travel, memoir and culture. He has taught at Bristol University and he currently tutors for the NCW Academy. His non-fiction book, Outpost, A Journey to the Wild Ends of the Earth, uses a series of personal journeys to explore landscapes which have inspired writers, artists and musicians, and asks, why are we drawn to wilderness? And his new non-fiction book, Overnight, Journeys, Conversations and Stories After Dark, is a wide-ranging exploration of the world at night and is set to be published later this year. Cool, that sounds brilliant.
Sounds brilliant. So Edward Parnell, who is joining Dan on the podcast today, has an MA in creative writing from the University of East Anglia. He's been the recipient of an Escalator Award from us, and he has taught creative non-fiction with us since 2020. Edward's second book, Ghostland in Search of a Haunted Country, which was one of my favourite books of the year.
So brilliant.
Brilliant book. It's a work of narrative non-fiction that explores the landscapes of the British Isles that have haunted our writers and artists, inspiring them to write ghost stories and strange fiction. And the book was shortlisted for the PEN Ackley Prize 2020 for memoir and autobiography.
And both Dan and Edward are tutors for NCW Academy, which, of course, we've talked to you about before, is our home for creative writing courses, workshops, mentoring and resources. Both Dan and Edward tutor on our online tutored creative non-fiction courses. Both got courses coming up later this year. You can find out all the details of that on our website. That's nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk/academy. And both the courses they teach on are the ones that we develop in partnership with the UEA. And as the name gives away, they're online and you can study them from anywhere in the world. So do have a look, particularly if you enjoy what you hear from Dan and Ed today.
Absolutely. So let's move on to Dan and Edward's discussion, where they compare and contrast their experiences of writing and publishing their narrative non-fiction books, which both happen to feature real and imagined journeys and landscapes. So they reflect on the importance of being open to all subject matters and commission possibilities, and how writing non-fiction allows you to meet and connect with groups of people from various walks of life. They also touch on the ongoing editing process of writing non-fiction, the advantages of not writing in a linear way, and the differences in the process and pay of writing a non-fiction book compared to a fiction novel.
Amazing. Well, I think we should get going. Steph, it's been lovely to sit next to you and record this today.
Hasn't it just?
And I hope everyone listening enjoys this wide-ranging discussion coming up. So now we will hand over to Dan and Edward.
Hello, Ed.
Hi, Dan.
How are you getting on?
I'm good, thanks. Are you all right?
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm up in Edinburgh. You're down in Norwich?
I am down in Norwich, although I will be moving to Edinburgh very shortly once I can find a place to rent up there. So,
well, I mean, that feels a bit like I'm glad you've told me that at the end. At the start, the end, because I would be like, oh, gosh, I didn't think the podcast went that well. He's literally moving up.
Yeah. God, he's a stalker. Oh, no.
Exactly. So we're here on the Writer Centre podcast, which probably is not its official name. And I think today we're going to be talking about kind of the process of writing, but it seems like a good idea to begin with what we've been up to recently. And you were saying just before we started that you've been particularly hectic. So what have you been doing?
Yes, well, I've been teaching my National Centre for Writing course, and I've had kind of a busy week or so with that. I'm editing anthology of ghost stories that's coming out in the autumn. And then I've got another one of those that's hopefully coming up soon. I've been writing an intro to a non-fiction book that they're reprinting one of the books I talked about in Ghostland, Ethel Colquhoun's The Living Stones, her sort of travel log about Cornwall. So I was delighted to be asked to write a foreword to a new edition of that. And then I'm meant to be working on a proposal for a new non-fiction book, but I do anything I can to avoid doing that and basically do any other work rather than working on a proposal, which to me is like a job application and a really horrible process that I have an increasing phobia of.
Applications are not the most fun, I know. But I mean, it sounds like you've become very much the go-to fellow for ghosts and ghost adjacent things. You know, everything following the last book is kind of arrowing that way for you.
I think it is a little bit. I mean, I think I wrote that book and it was based on a genuine sort of long-standing interest in ghost stories that I'd had since a kid. So it wasn't a manufactured thing that I created in order to write that. And then I suppose actually in writing the book, though, I rediscovered in the process of writing it, you obviously have to immerse yourself in all of that kind of material and read a lot more of it. So I read a lot more than I ever had done before. And then as part of that, I suppose I got slightly obsessed with it. And I still, even though I'm not writing that book anymore, my next book doesn't really have anything supernatural in it. I still quite enjoy reading all of those ghost stories. So if, the opportunity to edit a couple of anthologies which have been quite a recent thing, that's been nice to do, actually. Because my first book was a novel, so I probably see myself still as a novelist. I'm always thinking about novels I should be writing as well. And I guess there's a natural inclination after Ghostland where I suppose I have a bit of an audience of fellow ghost-loving people to think I really ought to be writing some kind of more supernaturally tinged novel. So that might be on the cards as well when I get around to it. Yeah. But I'm not very prolific. I'm a terrible procrastinator, and I envy these people who are knocking out books left, right, and centre. I realise now that's never going to be me. I don't know how you are with that.
I think the word envy is using a lot of heavy lifting there, because I know sort of people in sort of like, I think that there's that Nancy Mitford. I think it was one of the characters in one of her books calls people like that sewers. Bloody awful people, aren't they? Knocking out their books left, right, and centre. And I'm always, I'm envious of them, but at the same time, I'm aware that they're it's like my mother would say, there must be something wrong with them. There's trouble at home. Something, they're taking themselves away and working at all hours. They can't be happy.
No.
I think that it's funny though to pick up on what you were just saying, because a while ago I wrote a book called Climbing Days, where I went in the footsteps of my great grand aunt Dorothy Pilley, who was a very sort of famous, storied and trailblazing mountaineer, and I wrote this quite, I think, looking back, incredibly hopeful memoir in terms of its naivety, that I would just kind of like breeze along in her kind of like amazingly energetic, athletic mountaineering wake at a distance of, say, 70 years, and follow her through her story. And I discovered fairly quickly what an incredibly brave and brilliant mountaineer she was, and what a very sort of, weak and, inept alpinist I was. But since that book came out, I suppose to some degree I have been sort of bundled in with a kind of like climbing rating, which is entirely my own fault, and I'm not complaining at all. And the other part of this is that her original memoir, which was published in 1935, which was very much the sort of Rosetta Stone for that project, it was very much the sort of the talisman, and I was following a lot of the chapters, as I say, many decades later. I've finally got that book back in print this year.
Fantastic.
So it's coming out with Canongate in July, which is thrilling. And I've written the introduction, which I, as you were saying, it's lovely to be asked to do things like that, even though I am the least qualified person really to, look back and comment on some of the feats in that book. It would be very much like if I was asked to, write the introduction to a book about falconry. I'd be like, well, you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of those birds, would you? They've got enormous beaks. And so I'm doing the same, but with enormous peaks.
Yeah.
And I very much enjoyed writing the intro, and it's being republished. But I am occasionally approached to write and comment about mountaineering. And it's a little bit like, to use another analogy, Jerome K. Jerome being asked to sort of like write and comment on books about, the correct way to row a boat.
Yeah.
In that way, it's sort of like, well, I will take the money, but you should be warned that, I'm winningly inept is very much my brand on that. So I don't know, at least with your, with your books about the supernatural, you have some standing in that world, and there wasn't a high degree, I suppose, of farce involved, as there potentially was and actually was in my climbing things of the same thing.
No, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that I'm fairly skeptical on all things ghostly, although not entirely skeptical, because there was a couple of odd incidents when I was researching Ghostland. The oddest one was visiting Hemmingford Grey Manor, which is just outside Cambridge near Huntingdon. It's the home of Lucy Boston, who wrote the Children of Green No books. She came to it, I think, just during the Second World War, and it's one of those buildings that has the title of being one of the oldest. I think it refers to itself, or it gets referred to a lot as the oldest continually habited building in England. And there's probably 15 buildings that have that, I suspect. But it's a very old building that dates back maybe to Norman times or something like that. But anyway, I was visiting there to have a look around, really, in a kind of psychogeographic way, to see because it's where Lucy Boston wrote the Children of Green No books, and it's also the setting for those books as well. So the kind of pressing history that surrounds that series of books, it's very much based on those actual surroundings. So I went, and it was a very atmospheric day in the middle of December. It was a bit like the opening of the first book, The Children of Green No, which was also televised when I was a kid, when I was probably too old to be watching it. There was a BBC kind of adaptation at tea time that I watched, and I think I saw that before I read the books. But yeah, the book begins in a vast kind of biblical fenland flood, which is when the protagonist Tolly arrives. And it was at that kind of day when I arrived. Actually, drove up in the car, and there was just water everywhere, and it wasn't quite as dramatic as the book, but quite dramatic. Anyway, Lucy's daughter-in-law, who now owns the property, and she has occasional events there and has, open days and shows people around. So she was showing me around. There's a really nice music room that's got a one of those old-fashioned gramophones that's like in the HMV adverts with the little Jack Russell sitting in front of it. There wasn't a Jack Russell, but that was the room where during the war Lucy would entertain. She'd have airmen from the local air base come over and they'd have sort of musical soirees, and it would be, I guess, a kind of break for them from the horrors of what they were about to do and maybe not come back from. Then upstairs from that, there's a little staircase that leads to an attic room, and that was Tolly's bedroom in the book. So there were various artifacts in there that also featured in the book. So there was the little carved wooden mouse that's kind of quite totemic, and a wooden sort of chest that has various things that he finds in it, and a slightly creepy wooden rocking horse. Now I'm overbuilding this story because you're going to think that, the rocking horse starts moving or something, and it isn't anything like that. But so I'm there with Lucy's daughter-in-law, and actually there was a little dog, her little dog, which might have been it was some sort of little terrier, so it was a bit HMV-esque. But she was just telling me about various things in the room, and a book flew off the bookcase, a low bookcase on the other side of the room, sort of 2 or 3 feet into the middle of the room. And I was, well, what's happened there? And the dog sort of ran over and sniffed it, and then kind of sauntered back again. And Lucy's daughter-in-law just picked it up and said, these things happen here sometimes, and sort of went and quickly squirreled it away. But then sort of doing more research later on in Lucy Boston's, one of her volumes of autobiography, she talks about the sort of poltergeistic things that would happen in the house. And then later on, I found out that various kind of modern day visitors don't like, it's used as a spare room sometimes, and various people don't like staying in there. I had no kind of feelings of spookiness other than this was a kind of an odd incident that I can offer no rational explanation for, other than unless it was all a giant hoax to kind of trick me in with books on strings. But I don't think that was the case. I don't think the vibrations of our feet on the floorboards would have caused such a dramatic incident. So it was quite odd. But normally, I think, so various other places I went to, other friends who I don't know whether they describe themselves as more kind of psychically inclined, but they'll talk about, you went to Borley Church, I wouldn't go back in there again, and I felt all kinds of things. And I can just walk around anywhere and feel nothing, which is probably good when you're writing a book about ghostly things.
Yeah, to have that distance, I suppose. But also, I guess, I love the idea that you have different sets of friends with different sorts of books. So with these books, you've got your kind of like slightly sort of, I don't know, supernaturally attuned friends who would go, well, and then you have that sort of conversation like, oh, yes, well, let me tell you just off the top of my head, the potted history of all this unworldly goings on of there. And then whatever book you'll write next, you'll have a different set of friends. Yeah. So you're writing about the space race. Well, let me tell you, that we all, as writers, we all have these kind of sort of orbiting sets of useful people.
Yeah.
I have from book to book, I've realized that I have, something like that. I have people that I've met who I'm still in touch with, and sometimes they make an appearance in the next book, because that's the good thing about writing non-fiction, I suppose, that you can weave things together. I mean, you can do that for fiction as well, but with non-fiction, I suppose you show your workings slightly more, mate, and you don't have to contextualize things so much. You can just deploy somebody from a different kind of project. I'm still in touch with a guy who's fire lookout on top of Desolation Peak.
Oh, yeah. I've just been reading Outpost, so yes, that's fresh in my mind, all of that chapter.
Oh, excellent. Well, what a great post. And Outpost, I should say, for the podcast is available at all good bookshops, and the Book Hive in Norwich in particular. Because, as writers, we need to do that. I'm sure. And now I've discovered that I'm the only writer to have ever done that on this book. But yeah, so Jim is still, he's had an amazing life. He's currently still the lookout in fire season at this remote Belvedere on top of a mountain, which is where Jack Kerouac was in the 50s, and has become a kind of point, an apex of, I suppose, sort of pilgrimage. It's become a point of pilgrimage for quite a lot of people and is a scheduled national monument. But because
I like, though, that that's a point of pilgrimage for people, and that they've all got to make this arduous journey, and then people who probably wouldn't ordinarily want to spend their time hiking up mountains and having to get boats across remote lakes and things. I love the fact that in order to do that, they've actually got to make a real effort. That's good, I think.
Yeah, it's lovely. And it's all the more lovely that when you get there, you meet someone like Jim, because the fire service sort of Forest Park Service, of which a fire lookout tree is a very niche element. They generally employ veterans, US veterans. And, I write in the book that because there was no way of knowing who I would meet when I got to the mountain, having done all that, it was just as likely, in fact, not more likely, that you'd meet quite a taciturn person returned recently from Afghanistan with chronic PTSD, who'd been sent out into the boondocks to kind of like calm down, who might not be somebody who was terribly, interested in Karak or wanted to talk to a visiting, tourist writer, whatever I was.
Or someone who's gone kind of full Colonel Kurtz and
Yes, exactly. Yes, I've killed this moose. Would you like some? I'm not wasting energy on cooking it. We're just gonna have some moose sashimi. But it's interesting that Jim he was so affable and so interested and interesting that I'm still in touch, and he gives me regular updates from what he's doing out of season as a medic in some remote country, and it's all very American and feels like it could be written by Cormac McCarthy, his great hero, or maybe Dennis Johnson. He will send me an email and say, well, it's, nice to hear how, whatever's going with me, the fact that I've been, drinking coffee somewhere in Edinburgh. He went, a funny thing happened to me the other day where I was the first responder on a scene. We had a call, anonymous call, that there'd been some trouble. And I turned up and there was a pickup truck and the guy in the front seat was, recently dead of a shotgun wound, and there was no gun and the engine was still running. And I get back on that email and go, "You right, Jim? I mean, that does sound like something from a Jack Reacher book." And he's like, "Yeah, it was mysterious." And I just phoned it in and, the police turned up a bit later. I said, "That does sound like an active shooter situation, Jim. Are you sure you're okay?" But I wouldn't say he's blasé, but you see that sort of thing. There are roads around where he lives in Washington State where I think there's quite a lot of opioid crisis stuff going on out there. Quite a lot of sort of like random violence, and everybody is fairly tooled up out there with guns. So it's an interesting thing to get that sort of I suppose those missives come in. Yeah. And part of me has thought that it would be a very good book just to basically follow Jim round for a couple of months to see the sort of things that he does as this kind of first responding medic. And I don't know if you're the same. My ears are constantly open for new projects or new, avenues that I can pursue for books, because I find myself very interested in things that are happening to other people, because I suppose what happens to oneself, it becomes normal in that way.
Yeah, no, I'm like that too. I think my problem is I'm attracted magpie-like to all these little snippets of ideas like that, but then I'm never quite interested enough to be bothered to follow it through. So I think almost it's kind of like too much background noise and too many ideas, and I'm not very good at thinking, actually, yes, this is one. Let's follow this through. So I think that's partly why I'm so slow at getting on with writing another book, because I distract myself with various things. I distract myself a little bit with various ideas that sound quite good, but never really do very much with them and never really quite pursue it far enough.
Well, I try and get around that by purposefully getting in over my head and accepting things that have quite savage deadlines on them. Yes. And then kind of paint yourself into that corner where something has to happen, or very embarrassingly, nothing will happen, at which point you get a reputation as being, the reneger. Yeah. And I don't want to be that guy. So,
no. Deadlines are definitely good. I mean, I think that's the problem at the start of, or one of the difficulties at the start of that big kind of vacuous project that is the book yet to be written, that until you've got a deadline for it and someone's going to publish it, it's very easy to kind of lose heart with it, I think, or to not kind of put that extra effort in to actually make sure you start with it.
Which brings
I suspect I'm haunted a bit by, because my first book was a novel that took ages to find a publisher. And I talk sometimes a little bit to my students about this, in that non-fiction, I think, is a slightly different process, in that you have a hope of getting a non-fiction book commissioned beforehand so that you know that someone's going to publish at the end of it. As a novelist, unless I'm sure if you're a novelist who sells plenty of books and your publisher wants your next book, then you can be reasonably certain that's going to come out. But essentially, as most novelists, I think, end up having to write the whole thing and then hoik it around, or get their agent to hoik it around or whatever, with no promise that it will ever actually see the light of day. And I think, having been through that process for, it took several years for me to finish kind of it wasn't a first draft, but, draft 56 of the book, which I was happy with. It still took several years before it actually finally came out with a small publisher. So in that regard, non-fiction's quite nice in that, you know, if you can get through the slightly tedious commissioning pitch document sort of process, then yes, then at least you know that someone's going to publish it, which is then a good kind of drive to get on. But yeah, you can still procrastinate over the initial process of getting it commissioned, which is what I'm doing at the moment. But I do need to get on with that. So
I was going to say it's brought us back full circle to the, you know, the commissioning document. I always think my agent is quite sort of, you know, she's bad cop and good cop occasionally, and I live good cop moments. But, you know, I often think that original document is an opportunity to ask for the moon on a stick. So my current book, which I'm in the second edit with my editors. So It's gone through all the, you know, many rounds of edits with me, and then it was finished in early this year, and it went off to my publisher, and they've come back with the first round of edits, which is always, you know, it's like they've taken a combine harvester to my beautiful birthday, and, you know, they cut many thousands of words because I delivered over long. Unfortunately, because you know, before I got on to talk to you today, I had to download Chrome because I use a Mac, and I'm naturally quite an analog person, and the way that the track changes and all of the things that my editors do doesn't always show up on the programs that I use to write, which I think might be good, because if I knew what they were cutting and the depth of the kind of, you know, the vivisection that's been going on, I'd probably be crosser than I am, because at the moment I've just resigned myself to reading the bit before the line that says something's gone and the bit after, and if it makes sense to me and works and they've sewn it up neatly, the sutures are good, then I mostly let it go, because I think that's for the best. But it's an interesting thing, and I think the pitch document is a way of asking for that wonderful William Blake phrase, the moon on a stick. So you say, you know, with a great deal of hopeful naivety, well, the way this book's going to work is, and then there's a wonderful bucket laundry list of all the things that you're definitely going to do. You know, all of the wonderful interviews you're going to have with all of these people who you haven't contacted yet. But you're sure that they're, you know, Outpost, as you'll know, has the first thing in the book is an email I got from Werner Herzog, essentially saying that he didn't want to be in the book. But I've never received an email from Werner Herzog.
Well, I found that very exciting, and I was going to ask you about that. So how did you get an email from Werner Herzog? Because it isn't explained, obviously, as the opening quote. So that's quite an intriguing opening, I think, particularly for anyone who's recently watched The Mandalorian, where Werner Herzog incredibly appears as the kind of nemesis to the Baby Yoda character in a quite unlikely piece of casting.
I adore Werner Herzog, because he's done it a few times where he turns up in films as a sort of like evil person who just literally is Werner Herzog not really acting. Just the most gnomic version of Werner Herzog and saying, well, this is very unfortunate. And that will be the whole scene. You know, you must go and try again, you know. And you're like, are you acting here, Werner? Or is this the first time you've seen this script? Is this on, you know, audio cue or whatever it is? You know, you reading that off the auto cue. But so what happens is that when I was writing at Faber, my editor, wonderful Walter Donoghue, my climbing book there was a bit of an aberration for his list, because he is really the guy who does all the film book. He was responsible for bringing Martin Scorsese to write with Faber in the 90s. And at one point, one of my favourite stories about Walter is that he disappeared when he was meant to be, in theory, doing a bit of editing on one of my books, and then turned up in a Wes Anderson Christmas advert for, I think, H&M or something like that. And I was watching television at Christmas. I went, is that Walter? He's in a Wes Anderson. Why is he driving that train? Why isn't he editing my book? And that's the sort of thing Walter does. You know, he's Paul Auster's editor, and as it turns out, Werner Herzog's editor. And anybody who knows the books that have come out recently with Faber by Paul Auster and Werner Herzog, you can probably tell, reading between the lines, that Walter's quite a light touch editor, because both of those books are mammoth bricks. And I think that's why my agent is occasionally quite bad cop, because she's like, your editor seems a bit light touch with this project, Dan. I was like, no, it's all gold. It's all gold. She's like, well, just for the sake of argument, I've cut a further 10,000 words, which I felt needn't be there. I was like, oh God, really? That's all gold, Carrie. And then I read it, and of course I'm like, oh, well, fair enough, actually. Yes,
but do you get that initial, when there's that initial cutting, there's a real kind of, at least for me, I think with Ghostland, because I massively went massively overlong with the first version of that I delivered to my editor, and you sort of get the notes back and butchering it almost, and I remember being really angry until I kind of calmed down sort of half an hour later and thought, oh yeah, fair enough. With most of that, although it's a good focus to the things that it makes you focus on the things that you really don't want to chop out at that point, and it makes you kind of choose the battles and the hills that you wish to die on, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, with the new book, I've put back in a couple of quite long footnotes which explain the history of, for example, the Postal Service, which I really enjoyed writing and are slightly ranty. I just thought, well, no, that can go back in, because if you're reading that and you don't really know about the British Post Office and the Royal Mail, they're two very different things, that sort of thing. But I think choosing your battles, choosing the hills, not the overgrown hills. I always find, the things that I like, I'm quite a tangential, as this podcast attests, quite a tangential person. And then you have your fun during the drafts, that's for you. And I think that when the other people get involved, the professionals, editors and the agents, they're really trying to, get something that's honed. And you might think you've honed it. And in the climbing book case, I had a wonderful chapter all about yaks. And it was gently pointed out that this was a book about mountaineering and not yaks. And whilst that was nice, maybe I could place that chapter as an article in a magazine, a yak magazine, maybe.
There are many of those, obviously.
Yeah, Yak Weekly, because many people, which its big nemesis and is Yak Vogue, where all of the very stylish yaks, and then there's Yak Weekly, which is far more
Bovine Monthly, which is a more general magazine.
General, I don't know. I mean, yaks like to think of themselves as a breed apart in that way. I don't know that they do. But it's one of those things. And I don't know, there's also that, going back to what you were saying about the way that books are commissioned, it's always struck me exactly as you say, that publishing is so strange in the way that it carves up, non-fiction, a genre entirely defined by its lack. Yeah. It's not untrue. I blanch slightly at that. But also, if you're writing a book about ghosts, or a book about mountains, or a book about, as I just have, the night, you write a couple of chapters, you give them a breakdown of what the book probably will be, you say how it will fit in the market and your hopes for the book, and you write a kind of, beauty parade style. If you've got a new publisher, you essentially set out your stall.
And obviously you have to think of lots of books that you can kind of say yours is going to be like, but it's a cross between In Cold Blood and the Bible or something. All of that's good.
You can't say my new book, which I'm very excited about, is going to be like these three books, none of which are in print, because that really none of which you've ever heard of, because publishers at that point go, oh dear. But then if you're writing non-fiction, hopefully the publisher, once they've taken you on, will give you money to write the book. But then an advance is always divided into thirds. And the answer to all of these sort of like hanging questions that I'm begging here with sort of like, why is that? No one really knows.
No.
So you'll get your first bit of advance, which is a third of your overall sum, and an advance, of course, is pretty much a punt from the publisher on what they think you will sell. So it's paying forward royalties that have not yet happened. So the whole thing is quite labyrinthine, and the money is real, but at the same time the money is a prediction of what the book will do. So if someone's given a huge advance, there's quite a lot of pressure on that, because you've got to shift some units when you deliver it, and that's the publisher and whatnot. Anyway, you get a third. It might not be entirely weighted equally, but you get a third to write the book. You get a third on delivery, and you get a third on publication, which means that to write the book, you've only got a third of the money. And if you're a travel writer or traveling around to haunted mansions in Huntingdon, which, train prices and petrol's astronomical, you only get a third of it to do that. And you do all your heavy lifting on the third. Then as soon as you've delivered it and, you relax, I assume because they think that you're going to go straight down the pub and, drink your sorrows because of your sisters, they've taken a, cleaver to your book. You get a third for that. And when it comes out, you get a third. Whereas if you're writing a novel, exactly as you say, you have to write the novel on your own buck.
Yeah.
Then people decide whether or not they're going to publish it, and then they pay you for something you've already done.
Although they probably, in a novel, they pay so little for in advances at that point when you deliver it, apparently. Advances for novels, I mean, they're not great for non-fiction, but novels are just sort of sliding down all the time. So you could write a brilliant novel and they'll give you a £500 advance or something. Obviously, yes, if you then sell 1 million copies, you will be okay. You will earn, let's say, £1 million for it. But you won't deliver this manuscript for your novel that you've been working on for 5 years and get a big wad of money at that point. So
it's a great shame. I think we can all agree.
Yeah.
Anybody listening to this, however, writing's a wonderful and very noble.
It's amazing.
You should definitely do it, but try and come from a family that sort of like own Cornwall or something like that if you can, or I'm always interested in the non-fiction books that are written by people who've retired from doing something very interesting but very well paid. The tranche of books that have come out by people who are brain surgeons and now they're writing a memoir. Well, I can see why this attracted you, because you're still in charge and you probably don't need the money. And then it's always those books that sell, enormous bucketfuls, and you're like, well, they don't need that. Why aren't I a brain surgeon? Which is really the rub, I suppose, because we're very much not STEM subject people, are we?
No, and I guess the problem with that is that once people have read our books, they soon realise and think, I'm glad they're not brain surgeons. I'm glad they're just doing something where the only damage they can be doing is getting wet walking up a mountain, or they're visiting some slightly creepy house somewhere and then talking about lots of Edwardian ghost story writers. Well, they're not really hurting anyone doing that. So.
Exactly. I mean, my maxim that came from the climbing book was that bad in life is good in the book. And I suppose if you're a brain surgeon, that doesn't really hold in the same way.
Memoirs of the world's worst brain surgeon is not really it'd be an interesting book, but obviously
yes,
they'd have to write it from prison would be the difficulty.
Yeah, Gene Wilder would obviously play the lead character in the film. I don't know. It's a funny old business, and I'm always fascinated by other writers and their process, because books, to me, when I'm in the middle of a book, there comes a point where the book begins to tell you what it needs to be. Yeah. So you start out with your plan, and then the plan tries the world of actually writing and the world of research on. And obviously reality is a stronger force than having a plan. Looking back at all of my original plans for the books, I'm boggled by how I thought the book would be when the book is actually, the reality of the book being so different. I don't know if that's the same for you.
Yeah, and I find this odd alchemy that when Ghostland was commissioned and suddenly, okay, I've got to deliver 80,000 words here. That's then such an off-putting prospect, having been the thing that you want to happen, that you want to get this book commissioned and get on with writing it, and then suddenly you have to do it, and it's Christ, what have I said I can do here? I can't do this. And you gradually have to kind of eke it out, I suppose, and just start with something, and the thing you start with, as you say, isn't really probably not the thing that the book becomes. And I often think that we end up as writers overworking the beginnings of books, or the things that we think are the beginnings of a book, and spending so much time going back and reworking that. And then actually when you get to the end of the book, you realize, or your editor or someone else realizes, actually that beginning doesn't really work. It doesn't seem to kind of quite fit. It seems like a different project, because as you say, by the time you've kind of got into the process, this strange thing has taken on a life of its own, and a book's kind of form that's slightly different to the thing you envisaged, or slightly different to the way you set out when you were taking those kind of first stumbling steps into getting something down. I think that early bit may not be so. Well, I can only really talk about my own case here, but yeah, certainly I'm obsessed. And as well, I suppose, as writers, we're obsessed with getting the beginning of a book right, because that's the bit that readers you're going to have to kind of pull them in with, and equally publishers and agents and all the other people who you have to kind of get your work past. So you obsess about the beginning of a book, but actually probably with a non-fiction book, you may get to the end and realise the beginning wasn't really the beginning, and I now need to go back and rewrite that. That was kind of my experience anyway.
Whenever I was teaching, I spent a couple of years as a Royal Literary Fund fellow at Bristol University, and my advice to students coming in with essays was always write your introduction, which is, give me the context, give me the who, what, when, where, why, and how that I need as a reader, a reader who doesn't know anything but is interested, because that's always, from my point of view, that's always who I'm writing for. Somebody who's picked up my book and they don't necessarily know me or they don't know the book, but I want to, as you say, grab them at the start and then take them by the hand and lead them through this series of chapters or adventures or whatever's going on. And I would say to the student, you need to do that with an essay. And then you need to tell me what's going to happen, and then you need to make that happen, and then at the end you need to tell me what's happened. And then the final bit is go back and rewrite your introduction to allude to the thing that happens at the end to make yourself seem clever. Don't write in a linear way where you start at the beginning, write the middle, and then write the end, and then click send. You're in charge. So what I do with my books is I write the introduction last.
Yeah.
I write the first chapter. That pretty much will probably be the first thing that I do. With the most recent one, it starts in Southampton docks just on the eve of Britain leaving the EU. And so I'm down there in the container port and saying to people, the two main questions of the nights that I spent there were, do you know what's in that box? The answer to which was not exactly, often. And the second one was, what happens at midnight at the end of December when we, at that point, you're thrashing to get a withdrawal agreement that everyone was happy with, which obviously, we don't need to go into that.
We're all thrilled with the results of that.
Absolutely thrilled. It's really improved a lot of everyone, but particularly writers. And, everybody said pretty much, well, we've no idea what's going to happen, but we'll either carry on or stop. It just filled me full of confidence and joy in the whole process. But, that's where the book started. And that was I think December 2020. So we're in the pandemic there. And then the rest of the book spools off into the distance. You have different chapters there. And then it finishes at a solstice at Avebury. The book is about the night, and it finishes at the longest day, the shortest night, the light coming, the longest period of light in the year. And then the light beginning to go from there as we head into autumn and winter. But that's where it ends. And then after that, I went back and wrote the introduction, which does allude to all the people that I meet and some of the things that happen and my reasons for writing the book. Because I don't think that writers necessarily know their reason for writing a book, even all the way through commissioning, even all the way through most of the writing of that book. You learn your motivation as you go on. But why am I doing this? Because I think the assumption that everything happens in order, linear order with a creative project is quite mistaken. Because we're learning as we go, we're building as we go, and not inventing as much, but we're fashioning. We're fashioning this project. You have an idea.
Yeah, we're ordering and reordering, and a lot of it's the kind of the bits that you leave out and learning which bits to keep in, isn't it? It's an ongoing editing process, really. Editing what's, I think, with nonfiction, well, with any writing, but
yeah, I think that's the key. And as you said, a few minutes ago, this idea that the editor kills your darlings, and often that's necessary, but you only see that in retrospect, I suppose. There are some things that happen in an edit which seem harsh and unfair and cruel and unusual, but often, people are good at their jobs. We're good at our job, and we present them with, this wonderful beast, and then they trim that up to win crufts. And if we have been running about with our dog in the park and it's a very good park run dog, and then, they take that away and they put it through the salon and it wins awards for being a thoroughbred. We weren't even aware it was a thoroughbred. We just thought it was a really brilliant dog that we were having fun with in a river. This is a great analogy. I love this. It's
very good, yeah.
And they take it away and it seems slightly unrecognizable, but at heart, it's the same thing. It's just for a different purpose. One's for the public and it's for show and it's all razzle dazzle. And the other is quite a hard won thing that we have kind of form this relationship with and we're holding very dear, but that sometimes I think can get in the way because once you've worked on something for months, years, I think it's quite normal to lose sight of it and lose sight of not your love for it, but the point, I suppose, of it and the essential nature of it. And sometimes an edit can be thoroughly illuminating, I suppose, for a writer.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that interests me is people, and this must be for those writers we talked about earlier who are prolific and who have written lots of books, this must be a far more pressing problem than it is for me with my two measly books, but that have been, now several years old and are showing me up for being the laggard that I am. But it's interesting when people ask you a question about one of your books because they've just read it and obviously it's fresh in their mind, and they assume that as a writer you will, you'll be an expert on all the words that you put on the page. And of course, I think that you're an expert on those books when you're writing them, and they're completely all-consuming when you're in that process. But even a few months after, once you've let it go slightly and it's been delivered and it's gone off, or maybe whilst you're still kind of in the early kind of throes of, if you're lucky enough to be able to sort of, bookshop promoting it or something, you'll still have a memory. But 2 or 3 years on, and it's like, oh, did I write that? What was that thing about? Oh, I'm not quite sure. Who was that writer I was talking about? It's really strange how, but readers obviously think that you will kind of carry this stuff ad infinitum, and it's funny that I and maybe some writers do. I don't. That's maybe my increasingly poor memory.
Well, I think my mum had a chat with Ian Rankin, I think a couple of years ago when he was down in Bath promoting a Rebus book. And, they had a moment where they just were having a chat. And she said, I started rereading all of them last year and I'm up to number, at that stage, I'm up to number 11 or something. And she gave the title and there was a sort of slightly glazed blank look on Ian's face. And he said, oh yeah, what happens in that?
Yeah.
What happens? Because he's written 30 of them now, I suppose. And then she sort of explained a bit and he went, oh yeah. And but he hasn't spoken about that book for 15 years or something like that. And he did write it. And he did, invent all of it. And he was, as you say, utterly consumed in the moment. But then things move on. And it's part of that, the story, in the same way that your books and my books are part of me, and they're the reason that we're able to do what we do because we've written them, and they're part of our, I suppose, catalogue and calling cards for us. And they kind of, in interesting ways, dovetail into the current project, because you couldn't be doing this if you hadn't done that. But they are of the past. And I'm not very good, personally, I'm not very good with the finality of that. I like to stay in touch. I mentioned Jim earlier, the fire lookout guy. I'm still in touch with a huge amount of the people that I met for books. One of the reasons that I'm sort of, able to write books is that I wrote a book at the very start when I was at Norwich Art School about creative process, where I interviewed a lot of creative people from all sorts of arts, writers, musicians, photographers, painters. And I'm still in touch with a lot of them. And because two of those people in that book were Robert McFarlane and Stanley Donwood, who does the Radiohead artwork, we made a book called Holloway. That's how I was able to publish a book with Faber. Because of the Faber book, I was able to do the Outpost book with Canongate, and then they recommissioned, and I've got a new one with Canongate now. But the story of that is all luck and relationship. And I think a lot of people think that writing is just, the writer alone in a room with their books, or making very W.G. Sebald solitary meanderings across damp fields to haunted manor houses. Good Lord, you've got a very very Sebaldian approach. You've kind of taken that, haven't you? You are going across these misted fields.
I actually live in the town where Sebald lived when he came to the University of East Anglia. So I that features in Ghostland. I've actually uncovered some quite interesting information about the first flat he lived in, and a lot of the characters in The Emigrants were based on, they were the family of the people who owned the house, who actually happens to be the in-laws of a friend of mine in the town, which I knew none of this when I started writing Ghostland, but it was one of those happy coincidences that I then realised that, all the characters in the chap who ends up committing suicide, the character in The Emigrants, is based on a character who was the father-in-law of my friend, who had a similarly tragic fate. So but I knew none of that when I started. And as you were saying about how books came about, I think in a strange way, I think how, as I said, my first book was a novel, and I was struggling to write another novel for various reasons. And I had an idea about writing a next novel in which M.R. James, the Victorian ghost story writer, Edwardian ghost story writer, would feature as a bit part character, because he was, he was at the provost of King's College, Cambridge. So I thought, this might be a late Victorian set novel in which Cambridge features. And I hadn't realised at the time that a similar approach was taken in Penelope Fitzgerald's really excellent novel, The Gate of Angels, which has a kind of disguised version of M.R. James in. But anyway, I went to the place near Bury St Edmunds, Great Livermere, where M.R. James spent his early life. His father was the rector there. And it's a very atmospheric spot. There's this spring-fed mere, Livermere, which gives the place its name, this really ancient, very haunted kind of landscape. And there's an old, no longer extant manor house that was there in James's day, that you can obviously see kind of the echoes of that in some of his stories. But I went there just to kind of get a flavour, because I thought I just needed to kind of do something to kickstart my creative processes. And I came home and I wrote a little blog post about this. I was useless at that point, as I still am at kind of putting any material on my website, but I happened to put this piece up there. And because I'd sort of voluntarily organised a small literature festival in the town that I currently live, Wymondham, which is about 10 miles from Norwich. And I'd managed to get that year one of my favourite writers, Philip Hoare, who I think you know Philip as well. I didn't know him at the time, but I became friends with him because he very kindly came up to talk about Wales and Leviathan for our little festival. And afterwards, we sort of kept in touch, and it was a couple of months later, and I knew we must have talked about M.R. James at some point, and he was quite a fan of those ghost stories. And I sent him my little blog post, and he retweeted it. And then, because I guess he was published by William Collins or by HarperCollins, an editor there happened to, I guess, must have followed him and seen his tweet, read my article, my blog post, and happened to be on the lookout for someone was thinking about commissioning a book about all these kind of folk horror-y British ghost story and writers of weird fiction and old horror films and things, and then contacted me, and I went down and we chatted and got on really well, and I did a proposal, and the rest is history. But I guess it came about through me kind of slogging away for a few years, voluntarily sort of running this little literature festival. And then, yes, as you say, through one of the connections that I've kind of made through it, and a throwaway retweet that Philip did. So so who knows? It's odd where these projects can kind of get their momentum from, I think.
Yeah. And remaining in touch with people and putting things out in the world. I think I'm always really fascinated by this sort of thing of where it all comes from, because writers are, with exceptions, I think writers are endlessly generous in terms of talking about their passions, because if you're passionate about something, you'll want to talk about it. You'll want to engage and share the stories, which is what we do with our books. And things sprout from that. There's a wonderful interconnected web of both influence, but also people, conversations where people are helping each other with this sort of thing. It's kind of, I think it's a Picasso quote where he says, inspiration does exist, but it must find you working. So I think it's always important to be working at something, and it's always important to sort of like talk about it to some degree on this sort of, this podcast today, or with our students, or just generally, stopping people in the street and rabbit in a slightly Spike Milligan kind of way, because you never know what's going to happen. And I actually had a nice chat with Philip a couple of weeks ago, and we ended up talking about jazz. He's quite interested in jazz, and I'm currently reading a book by James Kaplan called 3 Shades of Blue, which is a 3-way biography of Miles Davis, John Coltrane and Bill Evans, because I'm fascinated by, I love jazz and I love listening to it, and I love having it on both in the background while I'm working and writing, because it doesn't have lyrics often, so that's quite useful.
I really want to say nice now in a jazz club fast show way, but
yeah, sort of like sweet, great, yeah, exactly. And it turns out that Philip, when he was out on Cape Cod staying with people when he was, I think, working on Leviathan, one of the people he knew had been in a relationship with, I think, Miles Davis' drummer or something like that. But that meant that because they were out there, they got visited. And this friend came down to breakfast one morning, and Nina Simone was there because she dropped in to visit this brilliant drummer. And he said, that would be great, wouldn't it? And I said, I don't know, because I've recently read Nina Simone's Gum, which is a book GUM, I should say, that came out with Faber, that was by the brilliant guy who's worked with Nick Cave a lot, Warren Allen, about a piece of gum that Nina Simone left on the piano when she'd done a Royal Festival Hall show for Nick Cave's Meltdown in about 2000, 2001. And this whole book has come out of the fact that Warren got up on stage after she'd left and took her piece of gum and put it in a tissue and put it in a Tower Records bag. And then it became this, wonderful totemic, piece that he ended up writing a book about. And the book is really about inspiration, and it's about, fandom to some degree. In that book and the record of Nina Simone's, one of her last concerts at Royal Festival Hall, I'm not sure I would want to necessarily come down and find her unexpectedly at breakfast, because she does seem to be, I think, irascible is the word. Obviously was her right,
Yes.
Absolutely her prerogative at that stage of her career to be as irascible as she wanted. And I adore Nina Simone. But yeah, it's interesting. And then, I get on to talking about Philip Hoare about jazz, and then I end up talking to you about that story here, and all these things, they percolate and they might come out in a book, because my books, I think, doubtless yours as well, there's a sense of unearthing an interest and telling a story, and these things that you didn't even know you wanted to tell, or that even you remembered, but they all percolate and they all pop up, and they can all help us tell these stories.
And you're never quite sure when they're going to sort of pop up and find their home. I think that's stuff we were talking a little bit about earlier, about bits getting cut from a book, or your piece that ended up in Yak Weekly, obviously, things like that. It's strange that you can think that you're writing something that you can do as part of the research for a book and think it's going to feature, and then you realise that yaks don't feature really. That's going to be in the next book that's dealing more with large farmland type creatures. Well, I guess yaks aren't really farmland type creatures, large mountain dwelling creatures or whatever they are. There'll come a point somewhere later on where that thing that you didn't write about, or you wrote about but it didn't quite find a home in the book you were working on, then will suddenly be relevant, I think. So it's kind of finding the right home for it, isn't it, down the line somewhere. But those kind of interests, and when you're sort of cherry picking all these things that we find interesting, if we're these kind of magpie-like writers, I'm sure that most of them they'll feature again at some point, even if the initial thing doesn't feature, but it might be the thing, as you say, it leads on to, that it might lead on to something else that you put into something.
Well, I think on that note, now what my next project is going to be. What are you working on at the moment? Like, what's your next project?
It's another mashup non-fiction book that's a mixture of travel log and nature writing and cultural criticism and a bit of memoir and random things thrown together, with a bit more international travel, hopefully, because Ghostland was very much UK based. So that's the gist of it, without getting into the subject matter, which would take too long. But it's a kind of Ghostland without the ghosts and a bit more international. There we go.
Yeah, great. My next book will be called Overnight, and is all about the things that keep the world safe and ticking over, and essentially going on while most of us are asleep and unconscious of the things that we rely upon, or the interesting things that are going on. So
Fantastic.
That's coming out next year. What an excellent way to end this excellent hour.
Yes.
Thank you, Ed.
It's been lovely, Dan. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. See you soon. Bye.
A big thank you to Dan Richards and Edward Parnell for their time.
As always, if you have any questions or you want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Writers Centre. We're on Facebook, and you can sign up to the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk.
As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. If you can, please consider making a donation over on our website by going to the Support Us page.
And if you enjoyed what you heard today, please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a 5-star rating and a review, because this helps other writers to find us.
Thanks again, keep writing, and we'll catch you on the next episode.